The digital numbers glowed a cold, unforgiving blue in the absolute darkness of the bedroom. 4:42 a.m. For the 1000th consecutive morning, the ritual began not with the gentle unfurling of possibility, but with the brutal, immediate assault of raw, unvarnished lack. The observer lay motionless beneath tangled sheets, listening to the rhythmic, mechanical hum of the refrigerator in the next room, a steady, unfeeling metronome measuring out the seconds of a life confined by constraint. With a hesitant, almost fearful motion, a hand reached out from the warmth of the bed, groping for the cold glass of the smartphone resting on the wooden nightstand. The screen flared to life, casting an eerie, lunar pallor across the ceiling. The banking application opened with a jarring corporate chime. There they were. The figures that made the stomach drop, tightening the solar plexus into a knot of cold lead. A balance so precarious that a single unexpected medical bill, a sudden vehicular failure, or a minor administrative fee would trigger an immediate cascade of financial collapse. Minutes later, the ritual shifted to the bathroom. The fluorescent vanity lights buzzed with a low, disgruntled frequency, illuminating the mirror a merciless judge that reflected every compromise, every deferred dream, and every physical manifestation of stress. The eyes looked back, rimmed with the exhaustion of a mind waging a silent, daily war against its own circumstances. Every line on the face, every posture of defeat, and every inch of physical reality whispered a single, deafening decree. This is what is true. This is the boundary of your existence. To the rational intellect, this is not merely a perspective. It is the ultimate, undeniable bedrock of reality. It is tangible. It can be measured, audited, and weighed. When the rent is due and the ledger is empty, no amount of philosophical abstraction can pay the landlord. When the body aches with chronic fatigue, or the home echoes with the hollow silence of absolute isolation, the mind insists that these physical markers are the absolute truth of the universe. Yet, within this very entrapment lies a profound paradox. The human being stands at the center of a universe composed of infinite energetic potential, yet remains utterly enslaved by a $300 ledger entry or a fleeting physical sensation. Why is it that the human creature, endowed with a consciousness capable of traversing the stars, remains forever shackled to the immediate feedback of the physical senses? What invisible machinery of the mind turns a temporary set of circumstances into an eternal life sentence? To deconstruct the tyranny of the visible, one must first examine the evolutionary programming that binds human consciousness to sensory evidence. From the dawn of human existence, survival depended entirely upon immediate sensory reactivity. The ancient ancestor who paused to ponder the abstract, invisible potential of a rustling bush, rather than reacting instantly to the tangible threat of a predator, did not survive to pass on their lineage. The human brain evolved not as an instrument for discovering ultimate truth, but as a biological survival machine, a filtering mechanism designed to prioritize the immediate, the physical, and the threatening above all else. Why does this biological inheritance become a prison in the modern era? Because the modern human is no longer fleeing saber-toothed tigers on the open savanna, yet the nervous system operates with the exact same primitive algorithms. When an individual stares at an unpaid electricity bill or an empty bank account, the brain processes that digital symbol not as neutral data, but as a direct, existential threat to survival. The amygdala floods the bloodstream with cortisol and adrenaline. The prefrontal cortex, the seat of higher reasoning, imagination, and quantum possibility, goes offline. In its place, the reptilian brain takes the wheel, locking the individual into a narrow, hyper-focused loop of immediate survival mechanics. How does this biological reflex morph into a metaphysical trap? Through a continuous, self-reinforcing feedback loop known in advanced cognitive science and esoteric philosophy alike as sensory entrainment. The mechanism operates through a rigid three-step cycle. Observation. The individual observes a physical condition. For example, lack of financial resources. Reaction. The emotional and physiological system reacts with contraction, fear, and lack-based identification. I am broke. Projection. That contracted emotional state broadcasts a precise frequency back into the environment, ensuring that the next moment mirrors the last. Every self-help guru, manifestation coach, and motivational speaker attempts to intervene at step 2. They preach the gospel of positive thinking, visualize wealth, smile through the pain, fake it till you make it, raise your vibration. Yet, these well-meaning prescriptions almost universally fail. They fail because they demand that the conscious mind perform an unnatural act of emotional gymnastics while ignoring the primal screams of the nervous system. How can a person genuinely feel the rich, expansive joy of financial abundance while the stomach is tied in knots by an eviction notice? How can an individual radiate radiant health while searing pain pulses through a physical joint? To attempt positive thinking in the face of overwhelming sensory contrary evidence feels like a blatant, insulting lie to the psyche. The conscious mind rejects the affirmation because it recognizes that the physical room is cold, the debt is real, and the mirror reflects lack. This creates the great psychological schism of modern spiritual seeking. The seeker feels like a fraud. They sit on a meditation cushion trying to imagine golden light, while their subconscious mind screams, "You are lying to yourself. You cannot even afford groceries." This internal civil war consumes vast quantities of mental energy, leaving the individual more exhausted, more depleted, and more deeply entrenched in their circumstances than when they began. The fundamental flaw in conventional manifestation paradigms is the belief that one must fight against the current reality to create a new one. But reality cannot be fought, it can only be transcribed. The physical world, the world of bank accounts, physical bodies, and environmental conditions is not the cause of an individual's state, it is the effect. It is the trailing shadow of a consciousness that has been entirely colonized by the tyranny of the visible. In the winter of 1908, within the freezing, soot-stained confines of a modest flat in New York City, a woman named Clara sat surrounded by financial ruin. The city outside was locked in a bitter frost, but the frost inside Clara's soul was far more absolute. For months, the letters had arrived with clockwork regularity, final notices from creditors, threats of legal action, and a looming eviction notice pinned firmly to her wooden front door. Clara was a woman of refined intellect and deep spiritual curiosity, having spent years studying the emerging metaphysical philosophies of the early 20th century. She understood, in theory, that thought was creative, that the mind shaped the world, and that abundance was a divine inheritance. Yet, as she sat at her small oak desk, with a ledger showing a balance of precisely $4.12, theory dissolved into the bitter acid of reality. Her heart hammered against her ribs. Every fiber of her physical being screamed at her to panic, to run out into the freezing streets, to beg family members for loans, to surrender to the crushing humiliation of defeat. The visual evidence of her poverty was absolute. It was written in the frost on the windowpane, the empty pantry shelf, and the threatening legal documents resting on the blotter. In that moment of absolute psychological despair, Clara experienced what mystics have termed the dark night of the senses. She realized that every single action she had taken thus far, every anxious calculation, every frantic budget adjustment, every sleepless night spent worrying about tomorrow, was an act of absolute submission to the physical world. She had been treating the physical shadow as if it were the substance. With a trembling breath, Clara made a radical, terrifying decision. She pushed the creditor notices away, closed the ledger, and stopped looking at the bills. Not because the bills had magically disappeared, they were still sitting right there on the desk, not because she had received a secret check in the mail, but because she recognized a profound, immutable law. To keep looking at lack is to worship lack. She walked over to the frost-covered window, turned her back entirely on the room, and closed her eyes. Instead of visualizing money, which she realized only reminded her of her lack of money, she focused entirely on a feeling of absolute, unshakable security. She imagined the quiet confidence of a mind at rest. She stripped away the specific currency, the specific creditors, and the specific material forms, and attuned her inner being to the pure, unadulterated frequency of divine provision. When fear crept back in, and it did, clawing at her throat with icy fingers, she did not fight it. Instead, she quietly redirected her attention back to the invisible anchor within. She spoke no desperate petitions, uttered no frantic prayers of begging. She simply claimed a state of inner sovereignty over her own attention. 3 days later, in a sequence of events that defied all logical explanation, involving an estranged acquaintance who suddenly recalled a forgotten debt, an unexpected freelance commission from an overseas publisher, and a clerical error by a utility company that erased her arrears, Clara's immediate crisis dissolved. But the external rescue was merely a byproduct. The true victory occurred in those 3 days of starving her senses of the food they craved most, the spectacle of her own disaster. Clara had broken the spell of the visible. The story of Clara reveals the primary key to escaping the labyrinth of unfulfilled desires. You cannot alter a shadow by attacking the shadow. You must turn your gaze toward the light that casts it. The physical circumstances of your life, whether they manifest as professional stagnation, relational emptiness, or financial depletion, are nothing more than historical records. They are the crystallized residue of past thoughts, past focuses, and past emotional states. When you wake up and allow your mood, your identity, and your sense of self-worth to be dictated by the numbers in your bank account or the reflection in your mirror, you are essentially driving a high-speed vehicle while staring exclusively in the rear-view mirror. You are steering your life entirely by where you have been, guaranteeing that you will crash directly into more of the same. To integrate this truth today, you must practice the art of sensory disengagement. This is not toxic positivity, nor is it reckless denial. It is a calculated, sovereign withdrawal of your attention from the theater of the third dimension. When you encounter a lack-based circumstance today, whether it is an unwelcome bill, a difficult conversation, or a moment of physical discomfort, pause. Do not fight it. Do not pretend it does not exist. Instead, consciously acknowledge its status. This is a historical artifact. This is yesterday's weather. Acknowledge that your physical senses are doing precisely what they were evolved to do, reporting on the past. But recognize with absolute, unshakable authority that the past has no mandatory jurisdiction over the next microsecond of your existence unless you grant it your sustained attention and emotional fuel. Withdraw your gaze from the screen of lack. Let the bill sit on the counter. Let the mirror show its reflection. Treat the physical world with the emotional detachment of a theatergoer watching a tragedy unfold on stage, fully aware that when the curtain falls, the actors will wipe off their makeup and leave the set behind. As you master this subtle, profound art of withdrawing your emotional investment from the visible world, a strange and magnificent thing begins to happen. The noise of your circumstances starts to quiet down. The frantic static of survival mode fades into the background, and in that newly cleared space of internal silence, something vast, ancient, and infinitely powerful begins to whisper from the unseen background. You stand at the threshold of a great awakening. You have begun to realize that the prison walls you have spent your entire life pushing against are made of smoke and mirrors. Beyond the world of solid forms, beyond the ticking of the clock and the brutal arithmetic of bank balances, lies an entirely different dimension of existence, a realm where all potentials are alive, breathing, and waiting for a conscious observer to call them into form. The invisible is not empty. It is pregnant with everything you have ever desired. And as we step across the threshold into Chapter 2, we shall pull back the veil to examine the exact architectural blueprint of perception itself, revealing how the lens through which you view reality dictates whether you remain a prisoner of circumstance or rise as the master architect of your destiny. The afternoon light filtered through the tall, leaded glass windows of a high-altitude study, casting long, amber slats of dust across a mahogany floor. Outside, the grand piazza was alive with a chaotic, vibrant theater of human existence. Vendors shouting over the clatter of copper wares, children darting between stone pillars with laughter like chiming silver, and a lone violinist drawing a melancholic, soaring cadence from his instrument near the steps of a cathedral. Two individuals sat within the quiet sanctuary of the room, separated only by a heavy wooden table, yet they occupied entirely different universes. To the left sat Julian, a man whose posture was a monument to quiet despair. As he gazed down at the bustling square below, his eyes narrowed with bitterness. To Julian, the noise of the vendors was not lively, it was an abrasive, chaotic invasion of his peace. The children were not joyful, they were undisciplined nuisances mocking the quiet order he craved. The violinist's melody did not soar, it wailed like a ghost lamenting a ruined life. Every sight, sound, and shadow fed a singular, internal conviction. The world is hostile, overwhelming, and intent on draining my remaining strength. To the right sat Elena, observing the exact same piazza through the exact same glass. Yet, a gentle, contemplative smile touched the corners of her mouth. To Elena, the vendors represented the rich, eternal tapestry of human enterprise and communal survival. The children were living proof of uncontainable, divine vitality, sparks of pure joy bouncing off ancient stone. The violinist's song was a masterclass in human vulnerability, a bridge connecting isolated souls to a shared emotional depth. Every sensory input nourished a quiet, unshakable conviction. The world is a magnificent canvas, brimming with hidden poetry and vibrant grace. The piazza did not change. The decibel level of the crowd remained identical. The physical vibrations of the violin strings struck both window panes with the exact same physical force. Yet, Julian and Elena experienced two utterly incompatible realities. How is this possible? If reality is an objective, solid container out there in the world, independent of the observer, why does it fracture into 1,000 different versions depending entirely on who is looking? What is the invisible lens that bends the light of existence, transforming paradise into a prison and a prison into a cathedral, long before the data ever reaches the conscious mind? To understand the architecture of perception, one must shatter the most seductive and persistent illusion of the human condition, the belief that we experience the world as it is. Human beings operate under the naive realist assumption that their senses act like high-definition video cameras, recording an objective, neutral, external reality and transmitting it directly to the brain. Philosophy and modern cognitive neuroscience unite in declaring this assumption utterly false. The human mind does not passively record reality, it actively constructs it. The core principle governing this construction was immortalized by the profound metaphysical teacher Florence Scovel Shinn, who realized that we do not see reality as it is, we see reality as we are. Why does the human mind refuse to register raw, unvarnished objective reality? Because raw reality is infinitely complex, overwhelming, and unmanageable. At any given microsecond, millions of bits of sensory data bombard the human nervous system. Photons, thermal shifts, atmospheric pressures, microscopic sounds, and invisible chemical signatures. If the conscious mind attempted to process all of this raw data simultaneously, the cognitive machinery would instantly short-circuit from catastrophic overload. To prevent this collapse, the brain employs an evolutionary filtering mechanism known as the reticular activating system, RAS, working in tandem with deeply ingrained psychological frameworks, core beliefs, and emotional conditioning. The RAS acts as a master gatekeeper stationed at the base of the brainstem. It constantly scans the environment for data that matches the individual's internal state, beliefs, and expectations, while ruthlessly filtering out everything that contradicts them. How does this internal filter systematically rewrite the external world? Through a recursive loop of self-fulfilling validation, the internal matrix. An individual harbors a subconscious core belief. For example, people cannot be trusted, I am fundamentally alone. The algorithmic filter. The brain programs the RAS to prioritize any micro-expression, vocal tone, or historical memory that validates this belief. The sensory confirmation. In a room of 100 kind strangers, the RAS will instantly spotlight the one person who scowled or looked away, delivering that single data point to the conscious mind as definitive proof. The behavioral output. The individual reacts with defensiveness, withdrawing from interaction, thereby forcing the surrounding world to treat them with cold distance. This is the psychological mechanism behind Florence Scovel Shinn's revolutionary insight. When an individual looks at their life and sees lack, illness, or betrayal, they are not looking at an objective condition imposed upon them by a cruel universe. They are looking into a cosmic mirror. The external world has simply rearranged its infinite plasticity to serve as a high-fidelity projector screen for their internal frequency. Conventional psychology often attempts to fix this by treating the symptoms at the level of behavior, advising individuals to act happier or change their habits. But this is akin to standing in front of a mirror, frowning at your reflection, and trying to physically paint a smile onto the glass. The reflection cannot change independently of the object casting it. To change what appears on the screen of your life, you must stop wrestling with the projection, and instead, climb upstream to the projector room of your own consciousness. You must deconstruct the inherited lens through which you view existence. The cultural conditioning, the generational trauma, and the survival-based assumptions that were handed to you before you even possessed the critical faculties to question them. In the spring of 1610, within the grand chambers of the University of Padua, a storm of philosophical terror was brewing. Galileo Galilei had recently constructed a telescope of unprecedented magnification, a cylindrical brass instrument fitted with polished lenses that allowed the human eye to pierce the veil of the nocturnal sky. Galileo invited the most distinguished scholastic philosophers and astronomers of the era to look through his invention. He wanted them to witness the moon's orbiting Jupiter and the rugged, cratered topography of the moon, discoveries that flatly contradicted the ancient Aristotelian dogma that celestial bodies were pristine, unchanging spheres of divine perfection. One by one, the venerable scholars stepped up to the brass tube. Cesare Cremonini, a celebrated professor of philosophy and a pillar of the academic establishment, peered through the lens. He pulled back sharply, his face pale, his breath catching in his throat. What did Cremonini see? He saw the mountains of the moon. He saw the distinct, orbiting satellites of Jupiter. The visual data was stark, undeniable, and luminous. Yet, despite staring directly at the physical evidence, Cremonini flatly refused to believe what his eyes were showing him. Later that evening, Cremonini wrote a letter explaining his astonishing refusal. He argued that even if the telescope appeared to show mountains and moons, the instrument itself was fundamentally deceptive. It was a mechanical trick, an optical illusion crafted by curved glass that corrupted the pure light of the heavens. He chose to trust the ancient authority of Aristotle, the rigid philosophical conditioning of his education, and the comfortable certainty of his worldview over the raw, unadulterated evidence right in front of his face. History looks back at Cesare Cremonini with a mixture of amusement and pity, mocking the academic arrogance that blinded a brilliant man to undeniable scientific truth. Yet, modern humanity commits the exact same intellectual treason every single day. Every time an individual looks at their life and insists, "My financial ruin is real, my loneliness is absolute, my limitations are permanent," they are acting precisely like Cremonini at the telescope. They have been handed an instrument of infinite expansion, their own consciousness, yet they use it exclusively to scan the horizon for evidence that validates their fears. They peer through the narrow lens of past trauma and cultural conditioning, rejecting any data stream that suggests a grander, more luminous reality exists beyond their current paradigm. The universe is constantly broadcasting an infinite symphony of abundance, healing, and profound connection. But like Cremonini peering through a corrupted lens, the human mind filters out the music, hears only static, and declares that the symphony does not exist. The architectural blueprint of perception yields a liberating, terrifying realization. You are never reacting to the world as it is, you are always reacting to your own mental translation of it. If perception is a construct, then it can be deconstructed. If the lens can be inherited, it can also be polished, altered, or entirely replaced. You are not a helpless victim trapped inside a fixed, unyielding room of circumstances. You are the curator of the museum of your own mind, holding the power to curate every frame that enters your awareness. To embody this truth today, you must master the discipline of lens checking. This is a daily practice of radical self-inquiry designed to catch your mind in the act of manufacturing its own prison. When you encounter a moment of friction, irritation, or despair today, whether it is an annoying delay in traffic, a sharp word from a colleague, or a sudden pang of financial anxiety, pause before you react. Step back behind the curtain of your own thoughts and ask yourself this vital, penetrating question. Through what specific lens am I choosing to view this event right now? Strip away the external details. Acknowledge that the event itself is neutral, a blank slate of reality. Recognize that the emotional weight, the narrative of victimization, and the prediction of disaster are not properties of the event, they are properties of the lens you inherited or unconsciously adopted. Intentionally remove that old, cracked lens. Imagine holding it up to the light, inspecting its jagged edges and distorting curvatures, and deliberately setting it aside. Replace it with the lens of the fourth-dimensional observer, the quiet, majestic awareness that knows every apparent obstacle is merely raw material awaiting transformation. As you practice this mental pivot, the heavy friction of life begins to dissolve. You will notice that circumstances lose their razor-like edge when they are no longer met with an automated, defensive resistance. With the lens polished and the mechanism of perception revealed, the veil begins to thin even further. You realize that reality is not stacked in a single flat layer like a painted theatrical backdrop. Operating right alongside the dense, predictable third-dimensional world you navigate with your physical feet is a vast, humming, invisible domain of pure potential. As we cross the bridge into Chapter 3, we shall leave the mechanics of perception behind and step directly into the parallel currents of existence, exploring the profound, life-altering mechanics of the third and fourth dimensions. The living room of the old Victorian home lay shrouded in absolute, tomb-like silence. Outside, a torrential summer thunderstorm battered the window panes, sheets of driven rain hissing against the glass, while jagged forks of lightning severed the heavy, bruised sky. Inside, the room was dark, save for the pale, ghostly glow of an unlit television screen reflecting the erratic pulse of the storm. An individual sat motionless upon a velvet armchair, hands clasped tightly together, staring into the apparent emptiness of the center of the room. To the ordinary observer, the space between the chair and the opposite wall was precisely that, empty. There was nothing there. No furniture, no people, no physical objects to occupy the void, only the stagnant, heavy air of a room left undisturbed for days. Yet, as the storm outside raged, invisible to human eyes, ears, and fingertips, a staggering, high-density symphony of information was screaming through that exact same patch of empty air. At that very microsecond, dozens of distinct radio frequencies were crossing the room, orchestral symphonies broadcast from a station 50 miles away, urgent news transmissions, and international maritime signals. Simultaneously, invisible waves of high-speed Wi-Fi data, carrying cinematic streams, encrypted financial records, and digital correspondence, sliced through the space where the individual's knees rested. Invisible cellular transmissions from thousands of miles away crisscrossed the floorboards. Not a single photon of this vast, complex data stream registered to the human senses. The room felt empty, the air felt dead, the silence felt absolute. Without a specialized receiver, without an instrument tuned precisely to decode these hidden carrier waves, the individual would live and die in the firm belief that the room contained nothing but space. Yet, the moment a simple pocket radio or smartphone was turned on and tuned to the correct frequency, that empty space instantly erupted into rich, vibrant sound, complex imagery, and actionable intelligence. The music was not brought into the room by the device. The music was already there, permeating every cubic millimeter of the atmosphere, waiting entirely for a receiver capable of registering its presence. Why does the human creature accept the impoverished report of its raw biological senses as the ultimate inventory of reality? What prevents the conscious mind from perceiving the multi-layered ocean of potential that hums silently just beneath the skin of the physical world? To master the art of conscious creation, one must transcend the single-track mind of the physical animal and grasp the profound structural duality of existence, the permanent, unbreakable coexistence of the third dimension and the fourth dimension. The third dimension, 3D, is the realm of effect, of measurement, of linear consequence, and of sensory confinement. It is the world of solid matter, ticking clocks, expiring leases, medical charts, and numerical bank statements. It is the domain where everything has a fixed location, a specific shape, and an unavoidable trajectory governed by classical mechanics. In the 3D world, things take time to move from point A to point B. In this realm, seeing is believing, and touching is verification. Why do human beings become permanently trapped within the boundaries of the third dimension? Because the 3D world is loud, heavy, and immediate. It demands attention through the crude instruments of pain, pleasure, lack, and urgency. When an individual's finger is pricked by a thorn, the nervous system fires electrical signals with such ballistic velocity that consciousness is instantly yanked away from the abstract and slammed into the localized point of physical sensation. The 3D world acts like a gravitational singularity. Its sheer density pulls everything toward its center, convincing the soul that there is nothing outside its heavy horizon. How does the fourth dimension, 4D, operate in parallel with this dense mechanical prison? The fourth dimension is the realm of pure energetic potential, of non-local awareness, and of waveform reality. In the 4D domain, linear time dissolves into an eternal, simultaneous now. Here, the finished architectural blueprint of every human desire, wealth, health, love, and purpose already exists in complete, unalterable perfection. Why must the seeker understand the exact mechanics of how these two dimensions interact? Because the 3D world does not possess creative power of its own. Classical physics and ancient metaphysics agree on a fundamental truth. Matter cannot create matter. Matter can only reorganize energy. The physical world is merely a trailing shadow, a printer output, or a materialized echo of what has already been established in the energetic matrices of the fourth dimension. When an individual attempts to change their 3D life by manipulating 3D circumstances, trying to fix a broken financial situation by panicking over spreadsheets, or trying to cure loneliness by desperately chasing social validation, they are attempting to fix a reflection by scrubbing the mirror. They are treating the shadow as if it were the source. The 4D realm operates on the principle of frequency resonance. Just as the radio receiver does not manufacture the broadcast music, the human consciousness does not manufacture its desires through brute force or hard labor. Instead, consciousness acts as a tuner. Whatever frequency the internal state aligns with, whether it is the low, tight frequency of lack or the expansive, of high-density frequency of already possessed fulfillment, will inevitably be pulled across the dimensional threshold, condensing out of the invisible waveform into the solid, undeniable particles of the third dimension. In the late autumn of 1921, within the dusty, grease-spattered workshop of an eccentric inventor in a remote provincial town, a quiet drama unfolded that would mirror the eternal dance between the visible and the invisible. The inventor had spent 3 agonizing years attempting to build a revolutionary wireless telegraph receiver. His workbench was littered with hundreds of failed prototypes, coils of copper wire burned to a crisp, fragile vacuum tubes, shattered in frustration, and iron armatures that refused to respond. According to the rigid standards of the local university physicists, his project was an impossibility. They pointed to the dead silence of his workshop, the empty air, and the total lack of any visible energy source as definitive proof that the signals he chased did not exist. The village elders whispered that the man had lost his mind, chasing ghosts in an empty room. Every morning, he woke up to the same, humiliating 3D reality, a workshop full of junk, mounting debts from creditors who mocked his ambitions, and a machine that remained as dead and silent as a block of stone. On a particularly freezing November evening, battered by exhaustion and the mocking laughter of his neighbors, the inventor experienced a sudden, radical shift in perspective. He stopped looking at the iron wires. He stopped treating the machine as a dead object that needed to be forced into action through physical effort. Instead, he sat back, closed his eyes, and contemplated the nature of the atmosphere itself. He realized a profound truth. The music, the code, the message is not coming from the machine. The machine is merely a dead shell waiting to be tuned to a reality that is already broadcasting across the earth. He did not alter a single circuit diagram. He did not solder a new wire or buy a more expensive component. Instead, with a quiet, unshakable inner certainty, he adjusted his approach to the apparatus. He treated the space around the machine not as empty void, but as a living, humming ocean of invisible intelligence. He delicately rotated a small, brass tuning dial, not looking for a signal to appear, but acting with the absolute, calm conviction that the signal was already there, waiting only for alignment. Within minutes, a faint, crystalline click echoed from the receiver. Then came a wave of static, followed instantly by the clear, sharp, undeniable cadence of a telegraph transmission broadcast from across an entire ocean, a message from a continent away, pouring effortlessly into a room that had been silent a moment before. The inventor did not create the signal. His tuning dial simply collapsed the infinite, invisible waveform into a localized, audible acoustic reality. The 3D workshop had not changed its physical dimensions, but a 4D reality had broken through the veil because the observer stopped fighting the silence and aligned with the broadcast. The lesson of the dual realms is both an immense liberation and a stern demand for self-mastery. Your desires are not distant future events located in some far-off geographical or chronological territory. They are immediate, ongoing 4D broadcasts existing right now in the room you occupy. When you long for financial freedom, vibrant health, or a profound romantic partnership, your mind instinctively projects those desires into the future. You imagine them as things you must travel toward, earn through years of suffering, or drag across a vast desert of time and space. That mental projection is the foundational error that keeps millions trapped in perpetual lack. To integrate this truth today, you must abandon the linear pursuit of your goals and adopt the posture of the master tuner. Begin by recognizing that the physical lack you observe in your 3D life, the empty bank account, the lingering physical ailment, the quiet home, is nothing more than a mistuned dial. You are simply receiving the static of yesterday's frequency. Do not fight the static. Do not curse the radio for playing noise. Instead, practice the art of internal dial shifting. When a lack-based thought arises today, pause, breathe into the space behind your eyes. Acknowledge quietly to yourself. That is only the old frequency echoing in the 3D room. The reality I desire is already humming in the fourth dimension, fully formed, fully alive, and entirely accessible. Shift your internal state, your posture, your breathing, your emotional baseline to match the frequency of the reality you wish to experience. If you were already wealthy, how would your shoulders rest? If you were already healed, how would your mind greet the morning? If your deepest relational yearning was already fulfilled, how would you walk through the world? Embody that frequency now. Do not wait for the physical world to give you permission to feel secure. Let your internal state dictate the tuning dial of your consciousness, forcing the dense, stubborn third dimension to yield to the higher, invisible architecture of the fourth. As you practice this tuning, the boundary between what is seen and what is unseen begins to blur. You realize that matter is not the master of consciousness, but its servant. And as we prepare to cross the threshold into Chapter 4, we shall plunge even deeper down the microscopic rabbit hole of reality, dropping past the level of cells, past the level of molecules, straight into the staggering, mind-bending quantum void, where atoms are 99.999% empty space, and physical solidity is revealed to be the greatest optical illusion in the universe. The midnight air was still, heavy, with the quiet dignity of an antique study, lined with leather-bound volumes that smelled of aged paper and beeswax. Beneath the warm, amber pool of a brass desk lamp rested a massive slab of dark, polished mahogany, a surface so dense, so heavy, and so immovably solid that a single blow from an iron fist would break against it with a dull, bruising thud. An observer stood over the desk, extending a single finger to touch the wood. The tactile sensation was immediate, sharp, and unambiguous. Unyielding resistance, cold grain, absolute permanence. To every biological instinct, every evolutionary instinct, and every waking moment of sensory experience, This table was a hard, unbreakable fact of the physical universe. It existed independently of the observer, an eternal monument of solid matter that would outlast the human hand pressing down upon it. Yet, as modern instrumentation and subatomic physics whisper through the quiet corridors of advanced science, this entire perception of solidity is a magnificent, highly sophisticated optical illusion. If one were to shrink down past the microscopic scale, past the cellular walls, past the molecular chains, and dive deep into the heart of the atoms, comprising that dark mahogany slab, a terrifyingly different landscape would emerge. In place of dense, unyielding matter, one would find a staggering, cosmic expanse of absolute nothingness. Imagine scaling an atom up to proportions the human mind can comprehend. If the nucleus of that single atom were the size of a regulation basketball resting proudly on the 50-yard line of a vast, empty football stadium, its orbiting electrons would be like tiny, microscopic dust motes, whirling somewhere out in the freezing darkness of the distant parking lot. The entire interior of the atom, the building block of the desk, the room, the bones of the observer, and the stars in the midnight sky is 99.999% empty space. What the human hand experiences as solid wood, iron, and stone is nothing more than electrical repulsion masquerading as texture, an energetic dance of subatomic fields interacting at light speed to create the compelling hallucination of substance. How is it that consciousness can inhabit a universe composed almost entirely of nothingness, yet spend its entire earthly existence cowering before the heavy, unyielding tyranny of solid objects? What hidden psychological mechanism translates invisible energetic probability into the brutal, unshakable concrete walls of personal circumstance? To comprehend the nature of manifestation and reality engineering, one must abandon classical Newtonian materialism and enter the strange, counterintuitive domain of quantum mechanics. Albert Einstein captured the paradox of human sensory existence when he remarked that reality is merely an illusion, albeit a very persistent one. The human mind is biologically hardwired to process macro-level physics, the world of tables, chairs, banknotes, and human bodies. In this macro world, things appear fixed, continuous, and immutable. But beneath this surface layer lies the quantum field, a churning ocean of possibilities where matter ceases to behave like solid objects and begins to act like waves of pure potential. Why do subatomic particles refuse to commit to a fixed state until an observer looks at them? Because at the fundamental level of the cosmos, the universe is not a museum of dead, finished objects. It is a living, responsive, participatory theater. In the famous double-slit experiments of quantum physics, particles of light and matter, such as electrons, pass through barriers as waves of infinite probability, spreading out across space like ripples on a pond. Yet, the precise millisecond an instrument measures or an observer focuses attention upon them, those expansive waves of probability instantly collapse into a single, localized, solid particle point. How does this quantum collapse translate from the subatomic realm into the macro circumstances of human life? Through the identical mechanism of focused human attention, the structural loop operates through a profound, inescapable metaphysical law. The field of potential. In the quantum field, the fourth-dimensional matrix, everything that can ever happen, every level of wealth, health, and joy already exists as an uncollapsed wave of pure energy. The act of observation. The human mind, acting as a conscious measuring instrument, continually gazes upon its environment, selecting certain aspects to focus upon with emotional intensity. The collapse of reality. Wherever attention goes with emotional conviction, the quantum wave collapses. The infinite possibilities narrow down into a single, dense physical manifestation in the third dimension. The perpetuation of form, because the individual continues to observe and react to that collapsed form as if it were an unchangeable absolute. The cycle locks into place, creating the illusion of a permanent, rigid reality. This is the hidden truth behind every major transformation witnessed in human history. Most people wander through life as passive victims of quantum collapse. They wake up, look at their bank account, collapsing the lack wave into physical reality, look in the mirror and lament their health, collapsing the illness wave into physical reality, and wonder why their life never changes. They are using their own power of observation against themselves, perpetually collapsing the exact same unwanted possibilities out of the infinite field of potential. Why do conventional psychological and self-help methods fail to break this cycle? Because they attempt to manipulate the collapsed particle rather than mastering the wave. They try to force a physical change in the 3D world through brute force, overwork, and desperate striving, ignoring the fact that a collapsed particle cannot be argued out of its form. To change the particle, you must withdraw your attention, return to the quantum field of pure potential, and allow consciousness to collapse a new reality into being. In the spring of 1927, within the austere, chalk-dusted halls of the Institute for Theoretical Physics in Copenhagen, a quiet revolution reached its climax. A young, brilliant physicist named Werner Heisenberg stood before a chalkboard covered in intricate mathematical matrices, grappling with a paradox that would shatter the classical worldview forever. Heisenberg had been studying the behavior of electrons within atoms. For centuries, classical physics had assumed that if one could only build a powerful enough microscope, one could observe an electron with absolute precision, knowing both its exact position and its exact momentum simultaneously, like a train moving down a set of steel tracks. Yet, every time Heisenberg and his colleagues refined their instruments to observe the electron more closely, the particle behaved with erratic, baffling defiance. The very act of shining light upon the electron, the act of observing it, altered its trajectory. The observer could not look at the system without changing the system. One evening, staring out the tall windows of the Institute into the darkening Danish twilight, Heisenberg experienced a profound epiphany that transcended mathematics and entered the realm of pure philosophy. He realized that nature does not allow an objective observer who stands entirely outside of reality. The universe at its core is profoundly participatory. He walked back to his desk and formulated what would become known as the uncertainty principle. He proved mathematically that at the deepest level of existence, physical properties do not possess fixed, independent values while they are unobserved. They exist only as a cloud of probabilities, a shimmering spectrum of potentials. It is the consciousness of the observer that forces the cloud to condense into a single, definite event. Legend has it that later that week, a perplexed visiting philosopher asked Heisenberg, "If this theory is true, does it mean that an electron only has a definite position when we look at it?" Heisenberg smiled quietly and replied, "We have to remember that what we observe is not nature itself, but nature exposed to our method of questioning." The great physicist had discovered in the laboratory what the ancient sages and modern metaphysical teachers had claimed for millennia. The solid world is a pliable, responsive canvas. When an individual stands before the solid problems of their life, debt, illness, or broken relationships and treats them as fixed, permanent steel structures, they are committing the pre-quantum error. They are treating the collapsed particle as the ultimate reality, forgetting that at the quantum level, everything is 99.999% empty space, waiting for a new decree from the observer. The revelation of the quantum void dismantles the final excuse of the human ego. You can no longer claim that your circumstances are solid, unchangeable facts imposed upon you by an indifferent universe. Every problem you face is structurally composed of the exact same subatomic dust as the solutions you desire. The only difference between your current lack and your future abundance is the pattern of attention holding the quantum wave in its present collapsed state. To integrate this truth today, you must master the practice of quantum detachment. When confronted with a heavy, oppressive circumstance today, a looming deadline, a difficult financial statement, or a physical ache, stop treating it as a solid wall of steel. Remind yourself of its true subatomic nature. This is 99.999% empty space. It is not a permanent monument. It is a temporary energetic pattern held together solely by the sustaining power of my own continuous attention. Intentionally withdraw your emotional charge from the problem. Stop feeding it your anxiety, your late-night worry, and your desperate mental rehearsing. When you starve a quantum collapse of its energetic food source, the form begins to dissolve back into the fluid, malleable field of potential. In that moment of release, plant your attention firmly upon the new reality you wish to experience. See it not as something you are trying to build from scratch with physical bricks, but as a wave of potential that you are allowing to collapse into your experience through the quiet, absolute authority of your focused consciousness. As you step into this realization, the dense weight of the physical world begins to lift. You realize that time itself, past, present, and future, is just another structural illusion of the 3D grid, waiting to be transcended. And as we prepare to cross the bridge into Chapter 5, we shall leave the quantum laboratory behind and ascend into the timeless eternity of the fourth dimension, where all potentials exist simultaneously in the eternal now, waiting for the sovereign creator to claim them. The grandfather clock in the dim hallway of the ancestral manor did not merely tick, it pronounced judgment. Each metallic drop of the pendulum was a heavy, unyielding footfall marching relentlessly across the narrow bridge between what has been lost and what is feared. An individual stood in the center of the room, breathless and sweat-slicked, clutching a stack of past-due notices in one hand while frantically swiping at a digital calendar on a smartphone with the other. The eyes darted back and forth between the ticking hands of the clock and the red numbers on the screen, calculating, projecting, and panicking. Every mental calorie was consumed by a desperate foot race against the calendar. The mind was perpetually bifurcated. Half of its energy was trapped in the post-mortem autopsies of yesterday's mistakes, while the other half was stretched taut across a terrifying, barren horizon of tomorrow, begging for time to move faster or slower, yet finding the clock utterly deaf to human pleas. To live within the tyranny of linear time is to be a perpetual debtor to an imaginary tyrant. The human creature wakes up every morning and immediately bows before the horizontal timeline, a straight, unyielding line stretching from an unchangeable past through a fleeting present toward an uncertain, threatening future. In this linear prison, a desired outcome, financial independence, emotional healing, a sacred partnership, is always conceptualized as a distant island located far down the river of time. The mind insists that between where the individual stands today and where they wish to be lies a massive, insurmountable expanse of grueling labor, agonizing waiting, and painful sacrifice. It will take 5 years to clear this debt, the mind whispers. It will take a lifetime to heal this trauma. Success is far ahead, around the bend, waiting for you to earn your passage. Yet, a profound, staggering paradox shatters this entire temporal illusion. If time is a flowing river carrying humanity inexorably forward, why do mystics, masters, and modern quantum physicists unanimously declare that the past and the future are nothing more than psychological constructs? What if the future you are starving and striving to reach is not ahead of you at all, but is already standing complete, finished, and whole in an eternal, motionless now? To unlock the higher dimensions of creation, one must undergo a radical deconstruction of temporal mechanics. The human brain, shaped by the evolutionary demands of biological survival, experiences time as a succession of sequential moments. This linear sequence, past, present, and future, is an exceptionally useful biological user interface, but it is a profoundly inaccurate description of ultimate reality. Albert Einstein's theory of general relativity delivered the definitive mathematical blow to the concept of absolute, universal time, demonstrating that space and time are inextricably woven into a single, four-dimensional fabric known as spacetime. In this cosmic fabric, past, present, and future do not vanish into nothingness or remain unwritten. They coexist simultaneously. Why does the human mind stubbornly insist that time is a linear progression when physics proves it is a simultaneous continuum? Because human consciousness is tethered to biological memory and sensory feedback loops. Memory creates the illusion of a solid past by storing historical neural firing patterns, while anticipation creates the illusion of a future by projecting those same patterns forward into hypothetical scenarios. The individual mistakes the film strip for the movie. They believe that, because they experience moments one frame at a time, the frames themselves are being manufactured sequentially in real time. How does this temporal illusion sabotage the entire mechanism of manifestation? When an individual treats their desired future as something that exists later, they anchor their vibration in lack. The operational loop of linear striving functions through an invisible, destructive sequence. The temporal gap. The individual acknowledges a desire, for example, wealth or health. The linear projection. The ego projects that desire into a future timeline, creating a mental distance between the self and the goal. I want this, but I do not have it now. The state of separation. Because the mind identifies with lack in the present moment, now, it broadcasts a continuous frequency of absence, the eternal delay. The quantum field mirrors that frequency of absence, ensuring that the future goal remains perpetually locked in the future, always approachable, never arriving. Why do traditional methods of patience and hard work fail to bridge this gap? Because patience is simply passive waiting rooted in the belief in linear time. It says, I accept that I do not have it now, but I hope time will eventually bring it to me. But time brings nothing, consciousness brings everything. In the fourth dimensional reality, the realm of pure, potential linear time does not exist. There is only the eternal now, the million-dollar enterprise, the fully healed physical body, the harmonious relationship do not exist in the year 2030, waiting for you to stumble across the finish line. They exist right now, fully realized in the quantum matrix. To manifest is not to travel across time to reach a goal. It is to collapse the spatial temporal distance by bringing the future reality into the present moment through a shift in identity. You do not become the person who will have it. You recognize that the version of you who already has it is an eternal reality existing simultaneously right now. In the winter of 1436, within the bustling, stone-paved heart of Florence, Italy, a master architect named Filippo Brunelleschi stood before the gaping, unfinished maw of the Santa Maria del Fiore Cathedral. For over a century, the grand cathedral had stood incomplete, capped by a massive octagonal hole in the roof that no living engineer knew how to bridge. The sheer height, weight, and structural mechanics required to build a dome of that magnitude, without collapsing inward, seemed an absolute impossibility across any reasonable timeline. Local guilds estimated it would take generations of backbreaking labor, countless financial resources, and decades of trial and error. Brunelleschi did not pick up a hammer. He did not join the laborers in hauling stones up the scaffolding. Nor did he spend his days pacing the piazza, lamenting the centuries of delay that had already passed. Instead, Brunelleschi sat in absolute stillness for days within the cavernous, drafty nave of the unfinished cathedral, staring up at the empty sky framed by the stone walls. He closed his eyes. Within the quiet sanctuary of his own mind, the cathedral was already finished. He did not visualize the process of building it. He walked through the completed interior in his imagination. He felt the echo of his footsteps on the finished marble floor. He looked up and saw the magnificent tiles curving seamlessly into the lantern at the summit. He experienced the complete, absolute reality of the dome as a present fact, not a future aspiration. When Brunelleschi finally emerged from his contemplation, he did not act like a man embarking on a multi-decade struggle. He acted with the calm, unshakable authority of a man executing a blueprint that already existed. He refused traditional scaffolding that reached up from the ground. He designed innovative hoists, interlocking stones, and self-sustaining masonry techniques that stunned his contemporaries. He treated every physical brick he laid not as an attempt to reach the future, but as the physical transcription of a reality that was already complete in his consciousness. Despite the skepticism of the city magistrates and the sabotage of rival guilds, Brunelleschi's dome rose with astonishing, unprecedented speed, completed in a fraction of the time anyone thought possible. Why? Because the structural reality of the dome had already been fully constructed in the fourth dimension of his mind before a single physical mortar stone was mixed. He had collapsed the future into the now, rendering linear time irrelevant through the sheer power of sovereign realization. The mastery of linear time is the ultimate initiation for the conscious creator. When you truly grasp that time is a flat circle where all potentials coexist in the eternal now, the frantic, breathless desperation of striving falls away forever. You no longer need to check the calendar to see if you are on schedule. You no longer need to look at your age, your current bank balance, or your past failures as proof of what is possible. Those are merely coordinates on a linear map that you are no longer obligated to follow. To integrate this truth today, you must practice the art of temporal collapse. When a goal, a dream, or a deep desire arises in your heart today, catch your mind the moment it attempts to shove that desire into the future. Notice if you catch yourself thinking, someday I will have this, or I am working hard so that eventually I can be free. Intentionally shatter that mental construct. Bring the desire directly into the present moment. Ask yourself, if this desire already exists in the eternal now, how would I feel, move, and breathe if I possessed it right this second? Drop the future tense from your internal vocabulary. Stop saying I will be. Begin claiming I am. Let your nervous system experience the somatic relief of arrival. When you step out of the river of linear time and anchor your identity in the eternal present, the universe reorganizes its infinite pathways to bring your physical reality into immediate alignment with your inner state. The heavy ticking of the clock in the hallway slows down, its tyranny broken by the sovereign realization of the eternal now. You stand no longer as a victim of past history or a beggar of future fortune, but as the master of the temporal domain. Yet, as the illusion of time fades, a subtle and dangerous trap awaits the unwary traveler. The trap of emotional desperation disguised as spiritual ambition. The mind, accustomed to surviving through lack, often attempts to rush the manifestation process with a frantic, gripping energy that repels the very thing it desires. And, as we cross the bridge into Chapter 6, we shall unmask the profound energetic difference between desperation and anticipation, exploring why neediness acts as a cosmic repellent, and how mastering the art of calm, absolute certainty creates an irresistible magnetic pull that draws your desires effortlessly into your experience. The rain tapped a frantic, erratic rhythm against the window panes of the small, overheated office, blurring the neon lights of the city into bleeding streaks of amber and crimson. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of cold coffee and old paper. An individual sat hunched over a cluttered mahogany desk, knuckles pressed so tightly against pale lips that the skin had turned a chalky white. Before them lay a single, crumpled envelope, a final utility demand bearing a stark red warning. With trembling fingers, the individual picked up a smartphone, opened the banking portal, and refreshed the balance for the fourth time in 5 minutes. The numbers remained unchanged, an empty chasm, a stark zero that felt less like a mathematical notation and more like a physical blow to the solar plexus. In that instant, a familiar, sickening physiological cascade swept through the body. The chest tightened into an iron fist, the breath hitched in the throat, shallow and rapid. A cold sweat broke out across the nape of the neck. It was the precise physical signature of terror, the ancient biological reaction to imminent peril. Every fiber of the individual's being screamed a silent, agonizing litany. I don't have it. I need it. If it doesn't arrive right now, everything will collapse. This state of acute, psychological and physical contraction is the invisible engine that drives millions of human lives. It is the vibration of desperation. Yet, within this very agony lies a profound and merciless paradox. The desperate individual believes that their intense longing, their sleepless nights, and their frantic mental calculations constitute proof of how badly they want their desire. They assume that the sheer volume of their need should act as a cosmic warrant, compelling the universe to rush to their rescue. Instead, the exact opposite occurs. The harder they grasp, the faster the objective slips through their fingers. The more violently they chase abundance from a posture of absolute lack, the deeper the quagmire of scarcity becomes. Why does neediness act as a cosmic repellent? What is the secret energetic law that transforms a desperate prayer into a wall of resistance, while turning quiet, unshakable certainty into an irresistible magnet? To master the mechanics of reality creation, one must dissect the psychological and energetic anatomy of human desire. The universe universe does not respond to what you want, the universe responds to what you are. In the subtle realms of consciousness, wanting a thing is a subtle, continuous declaration of not having it. Why does the frequency of desperation create an impenetrable barrier between the seeker and the goal? Because desperation is fundamentally rooted in the belief in separation. When an individual operates from desperation, their internal state broadcasts a singular, deafening message into the quantum field. Absence is my present reality. The nervous system interprets the lack of a desired object or circumstance as an existential threat, triggering a flood of cortisol and adrenaline that places the body into a perpetual state of defensive contraction. How does this biological and emotional contraction manifest in the energetic field? Through a strict law of resonance, the state of contraction. Desperation closes the heart, tightens the muscles, and narrows the focus exclusively to the perceived void. End of forni. End of forni. End of forni. The frequency broadcast. The emotional signature of need broadcasts a low-density frequency of scarcity and panic. The quantum reflection, the fourth-dimensional field mirrors this broadcast with absolute fidelity, presenting more circumstances, bills, and delays that validate the feeling of lack. The repulsion loop. The harder the individual strives from this place of lack, the more resistance they generate, pushing the desired outcome further away across the illusion of time. How does true anticipation alter this dynamic entirely? Anticipation is the polar opposite of desperation. It is not hope, which is often secretly laced with the fear of disappointment. Anticipation is the quiet, immovable certainty that a reality already exists in the fourth dimension and is simply traversing the final threshold into physical expression. Why does anticipation wield such magnetic power? Because anticipation is rooted in fullness. When an individual feels genuine anticipation, the body relaxes. The chest expands, the breath deepens, the mind rests in the sovereign peace of inevitability. Think of a traveler who has purchased a first-class ticket for a grand voyage departing tomorrow. They do not pace the platform in a cold sweat, screaming at the railway tracks, terrified that the train will not arrive. They sit calmly in their armchair, packing their bags with a quiet, joyful smile, knowing with absolute certainty that the journey is set. That emotional posture, the state of relaxed, joyous certainty, creates an open, expansive, energetic circuit. It drops all resistance, allowing the quantum wave to collapse effortlessly into tangible third-dimensional form. When you stop needing the outcome to survive, the universe stops withholding it from your experience. In the bitter winter of 1888, within the freezing, candlelit workshop of a brilliant but impoverished clockmaker in Geneva, a quiet drama of human endurance played out. The clockmaker had spent 10 grueling years designing a revolutionary astronomical chronometer, a device of such exquisite precision that it could calculate celestial movements with absolute accuracy. Yet, as the deadline for the Royal Academy's International Exhibition approached, the clockmaker's life was in absolute ruins. His workshop rent was 3 months overdue, his meager savings had vanished into raw materials, and his health was failing under the relentless weight of malnutrition and stress. For weeks, he operated in a state of frantic desperation. He worked 18-hour days with trembling hands, his heart pounding with panic every time the workshop door creaked open, fearing it was the landlord demanding eviction. In his frantic haste, he dropped delicate gear wheels, cracked sapphire bearings, and ruined entire assemblies. The harder he tried to force the final masterpiece into completion out of sheer terror of failure, the more hopelessly broken the mechanism became. On the eve of submission, sitting amidst a pile of shattered brass and broken tools, the clockmaker experienced a total psychological collapse. The panic burned itself out, leaving behind a cold, hollow numbness. He stopped working. He leaned back against his wooden workbench, stared up at the soot-stained ceiling, and let go completely. In that moment of absolute surrender, a strange transformation occurred. He realized that the frantic striving had been the true obstacle all along. He whispered to the quiet room, "If it is finished, it is finished. If I lose everything, I am still the maker of this art." The frantic tightness in his chest evaporated. His breathing slowed to a deep, steady rhythm. A profound, unshakable calm settled over his soul. He no longer felt like a desperate beggar pleading for success. He felt the quiet, joyful anticipation of an artist admiring his own completed work. He did not rush back to work with frantic energy. Instead, moving with deliberate, tranquil grace, he picked up a single tool. His hands were no longer shaking. His mind was clear, sharp, and focused. Working with the effortless precision of a master operating from complete inner sovereignty, he assembled the final escapement mechanism in less than an hour. When the chronometer was finally tested by the Academy judges weeks later, it outperformed every instrument submitted in a century. But the true victory was internal. The clockmaker had learned that the universe does not yield to the frantic clawing of the desperate. It bends effortlessly to the quiet, immovable certainty of the master in anticipation. The lesson of desperation versus anticipation demands an uncompromising audit of your own internal state. Examine the areas of your life where you feel the greatest friction, whether in your finances, your career, or your relationships. Ask yourself honestly, am I approaching this from the contracted, frantic energy of a beggar, or from the expansive, sovereign peace of an owner? To integrate this truth today, you must master the practice of somatic state shifting. The next time you feel that familiar tightening in your chest, the anxiety that arises when checking a bank balance or waiting for an important message, do not attempt to fix the external situation immediately. Stop, close your eyes, place a hand over your solar plexus, and consciously command your physical body to relax. Breathe deeply into the abdomen. Release the white-knuckled grip of the ego. Say quietly to your nervous system, "This is already handled. I do not need to panic, because what I desire is already an immutable reality in the fourth dimension." Feel the shift from contraction to expansion. Feel the heavy burden of need slip from your shoulders, replaced by the light, effortless expectancy of a child waiting for a promised sunrise. When you anchor your being in that frequency of calm anticipation, the energetic friction of your life vanishes. You stop pushing doors that are locked and begin walking effortlessly through portals that open of their own accord. The frantic noise of striving fades into a profound, golden silence. You stand no longer as a victim of lack, but as a magnet of absolute fulfillment. Yet, as this internal mastery deepens, you realize that this is not merely a philosophical theory. It is a precise, reproducible science of consciousness, the exact methodology that legendary metaphysical teachers used to rewrite physical reality. And as we cross the bridge into Chapter 7, we shall step directly into the sacred archives of Florence Scovel Shinn, examining her 7-year battle with chronic illness, her radical pivot from symptom watching to invisible dominion, and the exact spiritual laws she utilized to achieve a 95% physical recovery when medical science had closed its doors forever. The winter sun cut a pale, jaundiced arc across the heavy velvet curtains of a quiet New York apartment, casting long, dusty shadows over a room that felt more like a clinical fortress than a home. On a low divan piled high with goose-den at the billows lay Florence Scovel Shinn, her breathing shallow and labored, a fragile silhouette of exhaustion against the stark white linens. For 7 long, unyielding years, a chronic physical affliction had locked her body in a relentless vice. Specialists had come and gone like ghosts through the heavy oak door, their brows furrowed, their medical journals opened to pages of solemn prognosis, offering elaborate protocols, bitter tonics, and palliative comforts that did nothing to stem the tide. Every morning began not with the greeting of a new day, but with an immediate, somatic audit of misery, an aching joint here, a burning wave of fatigue there, and the heavy, crushing certainty that her physical vessel was a battlefield she was steadily losing. To the medical establishment of the early 20th century, this was the unassailable baseline of reality. A body broken by years of chronic illness was a physical fact, a biological machine suffering from mechanical failure, to be monitored, managed, and endured with stoic resignation. Every symptom check was a scientific measurement. Every pain was an undeniable piece of physical evidence confirming the absolute truth of her infirmity. Yet, within the stillness of that shadowed room, a profound and dangerous realization began to dawn upon her consciousness. She noticed a hidden, insidious pattern. Every single medical consultation, every frantic symptom check, and every desperate, late-night prayer for a physical cure required her to keep her attention welded immovably to the illness itself. She was fighting the sickness with all her might, yet in the very act of fighting it, she was feeding it the most potent food known to the cosmos, her undivided, obsessive focus. How is it that an individual can spend years desperately trying to escape an unwanted physical condition, only to discover that their very desperation is the invisible glue keeping the condition firmly anchored to their reality? What is the supreme spiritual paradox that makes fighting a problem the ultimate guarantee of its continuation? To understand Florence Scovel Shinn's legendary healing breakthrough, one must cross the threshold from third-dimensional medical materialism into the pure metaphysics of consciousness. The foundational error of human healing is the belief that a physical symptom must be altered in the physical world before the mind can experience peace. Shinn realized that the physical body is never the primary cause of anything. It is merely an indicator dashboard, a biological printer displaying the output of deeper mental and emotional blueprints. Why does focusing on the physical problem perpetually lock the physical body into a state of disease? Because attention is a creative act. In the quantum field of potential, whatever you give your sustained emotional attention to is instantly recognized as your primary instruction set. When an individual suffering from an ailment spends their day obsessively checking their temperature, cataloging their pains, reading medical forums, and praying frantically to be healed of a specific disease, their consciousness is broadcasting a continuous, deafening signal: I am sick. Sickness is my dominant reality. Illness is what I am observing. How does the mind weaponize its own healing protocols against itself through this mechanism? The recursive trap operates through a relentless, self-reinforcing loop. The physical feedback. A sensation of pain or fatigue arises in the 3D body. The obsessive observation. The ego panics and fixes its laser-like attention upon the symptom, analyzing its severity and origin. The emotional contraction, fear, resentment, and the desperate desire for absence. Get this away from me. Flood the nervous system. The quantum reinforcement, the fourth-dimensional field, takes that focused emotional intensity and collapses more of the same physical reality into the body's cellular structure. How did Shinn break this ancient, agonizing loop with a single stroke of spiritual genius? She made a radical, terrifying pivot. She understood that if she continued to pray for healing from the posture of being sick, she would remain sick forever, because her starting premise was lack. Instead, she stopped fighting the illness entirely. She withdrew her gaze from the physical symptoms, turned her back on the medical prognoses, and stepped boldly into the fourth-dimensional reality of absolute wellness. She began to affirm a truth that felt utterly impossible to her biological senses. I am healthy right now. Not I hope to be, not I will be when the treatment finishes, but I am whole, perfect, and vital in this very breath. She wasn't engaging in blind, naive denial of her physical pain. She was acknowledging a higher, immutable architectural law. She recognized that in the invisible realm of pure potential, her perfect blueprint of health already existed in unalterable perfection. Her task was not to create health through effort, but to align her internal tuning dial so purely with that invisible blueprint that the physical body had no choice but to reflect the shift. In the late spring of 1905, inside a modest, sunlit studio overlooking the quiet trees of Gramercy Park, Florence Scovel Shinn executed her radical metaphysical experiment. The winter of chronic suffering had broken into a warm, humid afternoon, but inside her body, the familiar fires of exhaustion and systemic inflammation burned with terrifying familiarity. For 7 years, she had played the role of the diligent patient, taking every prescribed tincture, resting on command, and tracking every fluctuation of her failing health. And for 7 years, the prison doors had remained locked. That afternoon, staring at her reflection in the heavy brass-framed mirror by her window, she experienced a profound spiritual mutiny. She looked past the dark circles under her eyes, past the pale, drawn contours of her cheeks, and spoke aloud to the empty room with an authority that stunned even herself. I release this burden. I am done fighting shadows. She walked away from the mirror. She closed her medical journals, locked them inside the bottom drawer of her writing desk, and refused to open them again. When a sharp spasm of pain shot through her physical frame, an unmistakable signal demanding her immediate attention and panic, she did not flinch, she did not reach for a remedy, and she did not whisper a desperate plea for deliverance. Instead, she sat upright in her armchair, closed her eyes, and shifted her attention entirely to the invisible, fourth-dimensional template of perfect divine vitality. She declared with calm, unshakable conviction, "Infinite intelligence establishes in me a perfect state of health. The divine pattern is now made manifest." The first 3 days were a psychological tempest. The human ego, accustomed to surviving through panic and symptom watching, screamed in protest. Every nerve ending in her body seemed to amplify its signals, demanding that she return to her old habits of worry and vigilance. But Shinn held her ground with the unyielding discipline of a sovereign commander. When fear knocked, she did not fight it. She simply redirected her focus back to the quiet, luminous certainty of her invisible wholeness. By the end of the second week, something miraculous occurred. The internal static began to subside. The constant, gnawing background anxiety dissolved into a deep, cellular stillness. Within months, utilizing this new inner guidance, letting go of long-held mental resentments, and anchoring daily in the fourth-dimensional reality of wellness, Shinn achieved a staggering 95% recovery from the chronic conditions that had held her captive for nearly a decade. She had proven for all time that the physical body does not dictate reality to consciousness. Consciousness dictates reality to the body. The Chronicle of Florence Scovel Shinn strips away every excuse of physical limitation. Whether your battle is with chronic physical depletion, professional stagnation, or financial ruin, the mechanical error is identical. You are feeding the shadow with your constant, fearful observation. To integrate this truth today, you must master the art of symptom starvation. Examine the area of your life where you feel the greatest physical or material pain. Identify how much of your daily mental real estate is occupied by monitoring, worrying about, and managing that exact problem. Every time you check the deficit, wince at the pain, or complain about the obstacle, you are feeding the beast. Starve it. Intentionally, radically withdraw your attention from the 3D manifestation of the problem. Acknowledge its presence without giving it your emotional fuel. Say to yourself, "That is merely the historical echo of yesterday's focus. I refuse to give it another drop of my life force." Shift your gaze immediately to the invisible blueprint. See yourself as already whole, already prosperous, already thriving in the fourth-dimensional reality of pure potential. Let that internal state become your new home. As you starve the problem of your emotional investment, the physical manifestation begins to starve as well, collapsing harmlessly away to make room for the new, radiant blueprint to take its place in the third dimension. The mechanism is precise, beautiful, and absolute. It is the art of reality, hacking the intentional redirection of the creative power of consciousness from sensory absence to energetic existence. And as we cross the bridge into Chapter 8, we shall dive deep into the exact tactical playbook of reality hacking, exploring how to permanently dismantle identity traps, stop trying to solve problems from the level of consciousness that created them, and step across the threshold as the sovereign architect of your destiny. The heavy iron vault door of the underground chamber stood slightly ajar, casting a long, narrow rectangle of golden torchlight across a floor littered with centuries of discarded brass tumblers, broken lockpicks, and rusted skeleton keys. An individual knelt in the dust before a massive, impenetrable steel mechanism that barred the final treasury of the keep. For decades, wave after wave of master artisans had attempted to breach this legendary portal. They had brought brute force, swinging heavy iron mallets against the hinges until their arms were bloodied and the steel remained unmarred. They had brought intricate, multi-pronged steel hooks, meticulously probing the keyhole for hours, sweating in the suffocating dark, driven by a frantic, desperate desire to force the deadbolts open. Every single attempt had ended in failure, exhaustion, and despair. Yet, standing quietly in the corner of the vault was an old master craftsman who watched the frantic struggle with a serene, compassionate smile. He did not pick up a mallet. He did not sweat, curse, or throw himself against the unyielding metal. Instead, stepping forward with slow, deliberate grace, he placed his fingertips lightly against the heavy steel casing, closed his eyes, and listened. He was not listening for a crack or a weak spot in the physical door. He was listening for the hidden, internal geometry of the tumblers, the invisible architecture of weights and springs operating deep within the heart of the mechanism. With a single, tiny, perfectly balanced copper tool, he applied a subtle, calibrated pressure to a single hidden point. There was no struggle, no violence, no loud clanking of metal. With a soft, musical click, the internal tumblers aligned, and the massive 10-ton steel door swung silently open on its hinges, yielding effortlessly to an intelligence that understood the mechanics of the system rather than waging war against its outer surface. To the untrained eye, this looks like magic. To the sovereign creator, it is the exact, unalterable science of reality hacking. Why do millions of human beings spend their entire lives bludgeoning the heavy steel doors of their circumstances with brute physical effort, emotional exhaustion, and endless striving, never realizing that reality is a lock that cannot be forced, but can only be opened by mastering the invisible mechanics of consciousness? To hack reality is to bypass the dense, sluggish mechanics of the third dimension and intervene directly at the level of fourth-dimensional causation. The term hacking in the digital domain implies finding the master key or the source code that governs a complex system, allowing an operator to achieve maximum transformation with minimal physical friction. Yet, human beings have been conditioned to believe that the opposite is true. We live under the cultural spell of the Protestant work ethic and Newtonian materialism, which preaches a brutal, soul-crushing dogma: no pain, no gain. If it is hard, it must be right. You must sweat, suffer, and struggle for every inch of progress you make. Why does the human ego cling so tenaciously to struggle as the only valid currency of success? Because struggle provides a comforting biological illusion of control. When an individual is working 18 hours a day, worrying frantically, and micromanaging every tiny detail of their 3D environment, their nervous system registers high activity as doing something productive, which temporarily dulls the underlying terror of helplessness. The ego would rather suffer a familiar, painful struggle than surrender to the quiet, terrifying simplicity of invisible creation, because struggle keeps the identity of the hard-working victim safely intact. How does reality hacking permanently dismantle this illusion? Through recursive psychological mastery. The mechanics of reality hacking operate through a precise, four-stage architectural shift. The cessation of direct force. The hacker stops trying to solve problems at the level of the problem. They recognize that trying to fix a financial deficit by worrying about money, or trying to heal a broken relationship by arguing over past grievances, is like trying to change a computer program by punching the physical monitor. The identification of the root code. They trace the unwanted 3D circumstance back to its source code in the 4D field of consciousness, identifying the core assumption, identity statement, or emotional frequency that originally collapsed the unwanted wave into reality. The sovereign recoding. Instead of fighting the manifestation, the operator calmly overwrites the internal code. They adopt the identity, the somatic posture, and the emotional signature of the desired outcome as a present, undeniable fact. The automatic realignment. Once the source code is rewritten in the fourth dimension, the third-dimensional hardware automatically reorganizes itself to reflect the new program, without requiring brute force or frantic external manipulation. Why do most metaphysical seekers fail when they attempt this process? Because they try to hack reality while wearing the exact same identity that created the problem in the first place. They use a high-vibration technique, I am prosperous, while secretly maintaining the deep, subconscious identity of a desperate person pretending to be wealthy. The system rejects the input because the identity signature does not match the code. True reality hacking requires an absolute, uncompromised shift in identity, a complete shedding of the old self to allow the new architectural blueprint to take root. In the late autumn of 1912, inside a cluttered workshop in downtown Boston, a master instrument maker named Arthur stood on the verge of total professional ruin. For over a year, he had been contracted by a major industrial firm to design a high-precision hydraulic valve, a critical component required to regulate extreme pressures in municipal water systems. Arthur had spent 12 exhausting months working around the clock. He had produced 40 distinct prototypes, machined from hardened steel and forged brass. Yet, every single prototype failed under pressure. The moment the test valves were subjected to maximum load, they either fractured violently or leaked water with catastrophic force. Debts were mounting. His reputation was hanging by a thread. His hands were calloused, burned, and shaking with chronic exhaustion. Every morning, he walked into his workshop like a condemned man walking to the gallows, staring at the pile of broken metal with a sickening mixture of rage and despair. He was trying every brute force engineering trick he knew, adding thicker walls, heavier bolts, stronger alloys, yet the valves continued to shatter. Late one evening, after a particularly brutal day where a high-pressure test destroyed his latest prototype and flooded the workshop floor, Arthur experienced a total internal collapse. He sank down onto a wooden stool, dropped his face into his hands, and stopped fighting. In that quiet moment of absolute surrender, the frantic noise of his ego died away. He realized a profound truth. I am trying to solve a design flaw with brute mass. I am adding more metal to a structure that is fundamentally flawed in its geometry. He stood up, pushed the heap of broken prototypes aside, and walked away from the workbench. Instead of engineering, he sat down with a clean sheet of paper and a pencil. He closed his eyes and mentally stepped inside the fluid dynamics of the water itself. He stopped seeing the valve as an enemy to be conquered with thick walls and began seeing it as a channel of harmonious flow. In a flash of pure, intuitive genius that bypassed all linear calculation, he envisioned a radically simplified, elegant internal chamber, a design that used the very pressure of the water to self-seal the valve, rather than resisting it. It required 90% less metal and possessed 0 moving friction points. Working with a calm, joyful precision that felt effortless, he machined the new design in a single afternoon. When the new valve was tested the following morning, under twice the maximum industrial load, it did not leak a single drop. It held with absolute, silent perfection. Arthur had hacked the mechanical problem not by working harder, but by shifting his consciousness from brute resistance to structural alignment. The mastery of reality hacking changes your entire relationship with existence. You stop moving through life as a laborer pushing a heavy stone up a steep mountain, and begin moving as a master architect whose blueprints instantly manifest in physical stone. To integrate this truth today, you must audit your current struggles for signs of brute force friction. Identify where in your life you are currently using a heavy iron mallet forcing a relationship, straining over a financial goal, or grinding through professional burnout. Acknowledge that whenever you encounter intense, agonizing resistance, you are attempting to solve a fourth-dimensional problem with third-dimensional muscle. Stop pushing, step back. Apply the art of the sovereign hacker. Withdraw your physical and emotional energy from the point of resistance. Ask yourself, what is the underlying assumption or identity state that is generating this friction? Redefine your internal code. Shift your identity from the struggling worker to the sovereign creator who already possesses the finished outcome. As you step into that new alignment, you will feel the immediate cessation of inner warfare. The doors that were jammed shut begin to glide open on silent hinges. The world bends effortlessly to the clarity of your sovereign intent. The heavy vault door swings wide, revealing the vast, golden treasury of your own infinite potential. You stand no longer as a victim of circumstance, nor as a frantic petitioner begging for scraps, but as the master hacker of your own reality. Yet, as every veteran traveler of consciousness knows, the greatest danger on this path is not external opposition, but the subtle, hypnotic pull of old, familiar habits. Every morning, the world greets you with the same old environmental cues, threatening to suck you right back into the ancient, repetitive cycles of the Groundhog Day loop. And as we cross the threshold into Chapter 9, We shall unmask the exact mechanics of how to break the Groundhog Day loop forever, exploring the daily tactical routines that make fourth-dimensional awareness your permanent, automatic state of being. The alarm clock pierced the pre-dawn silence with the exact same metallic, unyielding chime that had marked every morning for the past decade. In the dim, slate-colored light of the bedroom, an individual stirred beneath heavy blankets, greeted instantly by a crushing, familiar wave of heaviness. Before a single eye was fully opened, the automatic machinery of the mind engaged with terrifying precision. The hand groped blindly across the nightstand for the glowing glass screen of the smartphone. The thumb swiped open the email client, checked the bank balance, and registered the exact same stark deficit, the same pending invoices, and the same quiet, echoing isolation that had defined yesterday, last week, and last year. As the feet hit the cold hardwood floor, the body instinctively assumed the identical posture of weary resignation. Walking down the hallway toward the kitchen, every environmental cue, the rattle of the loose floorboard, the hum of the aging refrigerator, and the drab gray of the morning sky framed by the kitchen window triggered a cascade of identical emotional reaction. By the time the first cup of coffee was poured, the internal narrative was already complete. Here we go again. Another day of survival, another day of putting out fires, another day trapped in the exact same exhausting maze. To live within the relentless machinery of the Groundhog Day loop is to be trapped in a cosmic echo chamber. The human being wanders through life believing they are making fresh choices every hour, yet they are merely running old neural programs on an endless loop. They wake up in the morning, observe their current circumstances, react with familiar emotional patterns, and thereby broadcast the exact same frequency back into the quantum field, ensuring that tomorrow is nothing more than a photocopy of yesterday. How does the human consciousness become so thoroughly hypnotized by its own routines? What invisible chain binds the sovereign mind to a repeating cycle of identical limitations, and how does one shatter the wheel once and for all? To understand why life so often resembles a repeating cinematic tragedy, one must examine the neurochemical architecture of human habituation. The human brain is an organ of supreme biological efficiency. Its primary evolutionary objective is to conserve metabolic energy by automating repetitive behaviors. When an individual reacts to the same stressor, such as an empty bank account, a difficult coworker, or a chronic physical ache in the exact same way day after day, those neural pathways become deep, myelinated grooves. Eventually, the subconscious the individual stops consciously living and starts running on biological autopilot. Why does the subconscious mind cling so fiercely to these repetitive loops, even when they cause profound pain? Because to the biological survival mechanism, the familiar is synonymous with safety, while the unknown is synonymous with death. Even if an individual's current circumstances are miserable, full of financial struggle, relational friction, or professional stagnation, the brain knows how to navigate those miseries. It has mapped them out. To attempt a radical, uncompromised shift into a new reality requires the brain to venture into uncharted neurological territory, triggering an immediate, primal wave of existential anxiety. How does this psychological looping sabotage the fourth-dimensional manifestation process? The loop operates through an inescapable energetic equation, the morning calibration. The individual wakes up and allows their physical senses to dictate their emotional baseline based on existing 3D conditions. The chemical reinforcement. The body, accustomed to a steady diet of stress hormones, cortisol and adrenaline, generated by daily worries, begins to crave those chemicals, subtly engineering situations throughout the day to trigger them. The quantum broadcast. Because the emotional state today matches the emotional state yesterday, the quantum field receives the identical instruction set. Replicate yesterday's reality. The eternal recurrence. The third-dimensional world reorganizes itself to match that broadcast, presenting the exact same problems with astonishing clockwork regularity. Why do standard motivational techniques fail to break this cycle? Because saying positive affirmations for 10 minutes in the morning while spending the other 14 hours reacting automatically to environmental triggers is like pouring a cup of clean spring water into a stagnant swamp. The swamp immediately contaminates the offering. To break the Groundhog Day loop, an individual must stage an internal coup. They must interrupt the automated sensory-emotional feedback loop at its absolute inception, refusing to grant the external world permission to dictate their internal state. In the winter of 1792, within the grand, velvet curtain projection booth of a private estate in Vienna, an eccentric illusionist named Count von Stirling prepared an experiment that would stun the European aristocracy. For months, the Count had invited wealthy patrons to witness what he called the Theater of Eternal Return. Guests sat in a darkened parlor facing a massive, ornate gilded frame that served as a window into an adjoining illuminated chamber. Inside that chamber, an actor played out a tragic, exhausting daily routine, waking up to financial ruin, arguing with invisible creditors, pacing the floor in despair, and weeping into his hands as the clock struck midnight. Night after night, the audience watched the exact same tragedy unfold with horrifying predictability. The patrons whispered that the actor was cursed, trapped by some malevolent supernatural force in a relentless cycle of doom from which there was no escape. Count von Stirling stepped before the audience, smiled quietly, and revealed the secret mechanism behind the illusion. There was no curse. The actor was not trapped by fate. The Count walked into the projection booth behind the stage and pointed to a massive, intricate mechanical device, a loop of heavy celluloid film spliced together at the ends, spinning continuously through a high-intensity carbon arc projector. The projector beamed the exact same images onto a transparent screen in the chamber hour after hour, day after day. The actor is not suffering because the universe hates him, the Count declared to the stunned assembly. The actor is suffering because he is standing inside a room where the projector is running last year's film, and he believes that the shadows dancing on the wall are solid, unchangeable masters of his destiny. A young skeptic from the audience stood up and challenged the Count. If the film is spliced into a loop, how can the tragedy ever stop? Won't it play forever? The Count walked over to the heavy iron master switch on the wall, resting his hand casually upon the cold metal lever. The film only plays as long as the projector draws power from the central generator, he replied softly. The moment the operator walks away, pulls the switch, and inserts a new reel of film into the chamber, the old tragedy ceases to exist instantly. The past vanishes the moment the light of a new focus is cast upon the screen. The guests sat in profound silence. They realized that the Count was not merely talking about a theatrical trick. He was laying bare the cruel, mechanical architecture of their own daily lives. Most human beings were walking through life, trapped inside a theater of their own making, watching the same old tragedy flicker across the screen of their circumstances, weeping over shadows, while keeping their hands firmly welded to the power switch of the old, exhausted script. The revelation of the Groundhog Day loop demands an uncompromised, radical awakening. You can no longer afford the luxury of blaming your circumstances, your history, or your environment for the repetition of your struggles. To integrate this truth today, you must install the morning pattern interruption. Tomorrow morning, when the alarm sounds and the old familiar wave of heaviness attempts to wash over your consciousness, do not surrender to autopilot. Stage your coup before your feet even touch the floor. Execute the 3 steps of the master interrupter. The sensory freeze. The moment you wake up, before you reach for your phone, before you check your bank balance, before you allow your mind to wander to your to-do list, freeze, close your eyes, and become acutely aware of your own breathing. The timeline severing, acknowledge silently to yourself. Yesterday is dead. The old film loop has finished its run. Today is an unwritten, virgin canvas in the 4th dimension. The sovereign calibration. Intentionally, deliberately generate the emotional signature of the reality you desire before you engage with the physical world. Feel the expansive peace, the quiet abundance, or the vibrant vitality of your finished goal as a present moment reality. Lock that frequency into your nervous system like an anchor. As you practice this morning interruption consistently, the old neural grooves begin to wither from starvation, the automatic cycle breaks. The projector of your mind casts a magnificent, brilliant new reel of film onto the screen of your life, and the third-dimensional world reorganizes itself with astonishing speed to match your sovereign decree. The heavy iron lever of the projector has been pulled. The old, tragic film loop dissolves into a brilliant, pure white light. You stand upon the threshold of total liberation. Yet, as the noise of the old world fades into absolute silence, a magnificent stillness takes its place. You realize that you are no longer a passenger tossed about on the stormy seas of circumstance. You are the sovereign creator, standing at the center of your own universe. And as we cross the final threshold into Chapter 10, we shall complete our epic journey synthesizing every principle into a grand, majestic conclusion that crowns you as the sovereign architect of your destiny, revealing that the life you have been desperately trying to create has been waiting for you all along. The tempest had finally exhausted itself. Across the great expanse of the valley, the heavy, bruise-colored storm clouds parted, rolling back like a sodden stage curtain to reveal an infinite canopy of fathomless, crystalline indigo. Below, the ancient forest stood dripping and luminous, every leaf transformed into a polished emerald catching the slanting, golden spears of a setting sun. An individual stood upon a high stone promontory overlooking the vast landscape, breathing in the crisp, ozone-washed air. There was no tremor in the hands, no frantic darting of the eyes, no tight constriction in the solar plexus. The frantic inner civil war, the decades-long warfare waged against bills, mirrors, calendars, and phantom inadequacies had utterly ceased. For the first time in memory, the silence of the external world was mirrored by an absolute, unshakable stillness within. The observer looked down at their own palms, then outward toward the majestic horizon, gripped by a profound, breathtaking realization. The world out there is not happening to me, it is happening through me. The bank balances, the physical symptoms, the relational echoes, and the ticking clocks were no longer terrifying jailers holding a helpless soul in chains. They were recognized for what they truly were. Soft clay upon a potter's wheel, awaiting the quiet, sovereign command of conscious attention. To stand upon this peak of awareness is to cross the final frontier of human evolution. Yet, a majestic paradox lingers at the summit. If the universe is infinitely malleable, waiting entirely upon the decree of consciousness, why do so many who glimpse this truth slip back into the valleys of old limitation? What is the final, invisible anchor that keeps the human spirit tethered to the shore? And what is the ultimate initiation required to claim the crown of the sovereign creator? To arrive at the final chapter of manifestation is to realize that the entire journey was never about changing the world. It was about remembering who you are. Human consciousness begins its terrestrial existence in a state of deep, unconscious slumber, a sleepwalking sleep where the individual identifies entirely with the physical vehicle, the cultural conditioning, and the chaotic play of third-dimensional shadows. As the seeker awakens, they transition from an unconscious victim to an active petitioner, begging the universe for favors, reciting affirmations with clenched teeth, and treating manifestation as a technique to acquire toys and comforts. Why must the seeker ultimately outgrow even the desire to manifest things? Because the very concept of manifestation implies separation. The belief that there is a me over here, and a desired object over there, that needs to be pulled across a gap. When an individual operates as a manifester, they are still subtly validating lack, treating the universe as a cosmic vending machine that requires the correct combination of mental coins to dispense rewards. How does the sovereign creator transcend the mechanics of striving entirely? Through a radical, non-dual realization operating via recursive integration. The dissolution of separation. The creator realizes that consciousness and reality are not two distinct entities interacting. They are a singular, unified continuum. There is no outside. The reclamation of authority. The creator stops looking for external signs, validations, or permissions from the 3D world to confirm their worth or success. The embodiment of sovereignty. They no longer ask for what they desire. They recognize that desiring is redundant because the self and the desire have melted into a single, indivisible identity. The eternal emanation. From this state of absolute wholeness, reality ceases to be something that is created through effort and becomes something that simply emanates naturally from their presence, like light radiating effortlessly from a burning star. Why do most individuals fail to cross this final threshold? Because the ego fears sovereignty more than it fears suffering. Suffering is comfortable because it provides an identity, an excuse, and a community of fellow victims. Sovereignty is terrifyingly lonely to the small self, because it strips away all external scapegoats. When you accept that you are the sovereign architect of your reality, you can no longer blame the economy, your parents, your past, or your luck. You stand utterly naked and magnificent before the mirror of infinity, holding the pen that writes every line of your existence. In the late autumn of 1504, within the cavernous, stone-dust-choked atelier of the Opera del Duomo in Florence, a young sculptor named Michelangelo stood before an immense, deformed block of Carrara marble that had been discarded and left to weather in the courtyard for decades. Generations of master sculptors had inspected the massive stone and rejected it. They declared it flawed, marred by deep veins, jagged mineral inclusions, and structural weaknesses that would cause the entire block to fracture under the chisel. It was deemed unworkable, a stubborn piece of dead matter resisting human intent. For nearly 3 years, Michelangelo locked himself within the dim sanctuary of his workshop. He did not engage in frantic, violent blows against the stone. Witnesses reported that he would often sit on a wooden stool for hours simply staring at the massive marble monolith, unmoving, his eyes tracing its contours with quiet, unshakable reverence. He was not planning how to carve a statue into the stone. He was practicing the ultimate art of recognition. When visitors finally broke through his doors and beheld the unveiling of the David, Europe stood paralyzed in collective awe. The massive flawed block of discarded marble had vanished, replaced by a figure of breathtaking, divine perfection, every sinew taut with life, every gaze fixed with sovereign majesty upon an unseen horizon. Cardinal Soderini, the ruler of Florence, stepped forward, examined the masterpiece, and whispered in stunned disbelief, "Master Michelangelo, how did you ever create such a miracle from a stone, so flawed and dead?" Michelangelo looked down at his dust-covered hands, smiled quietly, and replied with words that would echo down the corridors of human history. "It was simple, Eminence. The David was already inside the marble. I merely chipped away everything that was not David." The great sculptor did not force the form into existence through brute labor. He recognized the perfection that already existed in the hidden depth of the stone and released it from the illusion of the surrounding debris. That is the exact posture of the sovereign creator. You do not need to manufacture your ideal life, your health, or your abundance out of nothingness through sweat and strain. The finished, magnificent masterpiece of your existence is already complete within the fourth-dimensional matrix of your consciousness. Your sole task is to chip away the debris of doubt, the heavy ash of fear, and the frantic noise of sensory lack, allowing the magnificence of your true reality to step forth into the light. The journey through these 10 chapters has stripped away your illusions, dismantled your prisons, and restored your crown. You are no longer the victim of the visible, the prisoner of perception, the slave of linear time, or the beggar of desperation. You stand upon the summit as the sovereign creator. To integrate this ultimate truth today, you must drop all remaining techniques, abandon all future-focused strategies, and rest entirely in the profound, unshakable majesty of your own presence. When you step back into the bustling theater of daily life today, when you walk down the street, sit at your desk, or engage with the world, carry yourself with the silent, radiant dignity of one who knows the secret code of existence. Do not look to the third-dimensional world for validation. Do not ask the mirror if you are worthy, and do not ask the clock if it is time. You are the source from which all time, all space, and all forms emanate. Whatever you decree in the quiet sanctuary of your own being is instantly sealed by the immutable laws of the cosmos. Let your breath be deep, steady, and calm. Let your gaze be clear and fearless. Let your heart rest in the absolute, rapturous certainty that the life you have desperately sought, dreamed of, and wept for has never been lost. It has been waiting patiently behind the veil of your own senses, waiting for you to claim your throne. The manuscript is complete. The stage fades to gold. The invisible reality is now your waking breath. Go forth and command your universe.